Hi guys. Okay, last part, I promise, of this lecture. So I hopefully you guys all went and watched that commercial that I linked to on Blackboard. So I want to use this commercial just to kind of give you guys a sort of a sense of the kind of analytical work that I want you to do in this essay, and to help us kind of think about how we can use schools. Um, so if we look, so with this commercial. If we were doing this live, I would try to get you guys to come up with all of these bits of analysis, but I'll just have to sort of feed them to you now since we're not all in the same room together. Um, so, how do we figure out how do we apply Scholes's method to this commercial? What can we say about this commercial? So, I think that one good place to start would be to think about these lumberjacks, like why this is set in this like lumber with these lumberjacks, right? What do they look like compared to like this guy who you see on your screen, the other comedian, and Roseanne. And I think that one thing we could say about these lumberjacks is that they are, so we can tell from the way they're being portrayed that they're hardworking, right? They're presenting this kind of like blue collar ideal of people who work hard. And versus this New York comedian, right, who can't do anything right, who's lazy, who just wants to take a break. The other thing about these guys is that they're presenting this kind of image of masculinity, right? They're manly men who are out there working with their hands versus this New York comedian, right, and versus Roseanne Barr. And what happens here then, of course, in the commercial is that the comedian eats the Snickers and then he's and that's what's going to transform him into one of these lumberjack guys. So I think that if you are there's a first kind of level of analysis where we can say that what this commercial seems to be, the sort of cultural reinforcement that it seems to be operating with, what the kind of values and beliefs that it's promoting have to do with the kind of ideal of masculine blue collar work, right? That's kind of what we believe in this commercial. I think it's also interesting to think about why it's totally fine in this commercial to wipe out Roseanne Barr with that log at the end, and I think it's because she's we wouldn't laugh, right, if that was I think we'd be less likely to laugh if that was happening to like Gwyneth Paltrow or someone, or Taylor Swift or somebody like that. But it's funny if it's Roseanne, and I think it's because of the gender thing that's happening here, right? That she's not girly, right? She doesn't fit into this world, right? So these men don't want to take care of her, right? Instead, they just want to shut her up. So in a funny way, kind of. So I think I think that even makes it more clear, in terms of what the kinds of values and beliefs that this commercial appears to be reinforcing. So that's an example of how you might use Scholes' methodology, right? Which is to say, to look at commercials to see what kinds of values and beliefs they're trying to make us feel good about, right? Trying to unpack what those values and beliefs are. That's the first step of our analysis. That's the key step we need to make in the draft, right? Which is to test out Scholes' theory on this kind of commercial. I think there's this whole gender element here that doesn't really appear in Scholes' analysis of his Budweiser commercial, which I think we can add. I think that's a good place where we can kind of use Scholes' method and then go a little bit beyond it. So that's an example of how we might analyze a commercial using Scholes. Okay, so as we do that, where we're ultimately trying to go with this essay is to figure out a thesis, right? So let's spend a little bit of time just talking about what a thesis is. I know you've covered this in English 101, but I want to. It's one of the most important things about an analytical essay, so it merits a little bit more attention. So as you all, I'm sure, know, a thesis is just a point, a purpose, an argument. That's all it is. And everything we've written so far has had a point, right? Your Yelp review had a point. Your reflection essay had a point. We're just using a more formal vocabulary to talk about it when we get to this kind of writing. So I want to emphasize a couple of things about a thesis, about what makes a good thesis. So a good thesis has to be debatable, which means that it could be argued against and thus needs to be argued for. So I want you to be thinking about a thesis that a reasonable person might well oppose. And that's a hard thing, right? Because it seems to kind of push against the other standard, another characteristic of a good thesis, which is that it's provable, right? You need to be able to prove your thesis within the confines of your assignment, right? And you need to be able to have the evidence to prove that thesis. And finally, a good thesis is early, right? It appears early on in the essay. So debatability and provability are principles that are in tension with each other, right? Your argument needs to be unexpected, different, surprising, thus debatable, but also it needs to be reasonable, and you need to have the evidence to be able to prove it. So it needs to be provable. We're trying to hit the sweet spot where we have both of those sort of held in tension, right? Where we find an argument that is both provable but also debatable at the same time. And it is not at all uncommon when you're writing a fairly complex essay to not really figure out what your thesis is until the end. I mean, you'll have something to start with, right? But very often that thesis will not be what you end up with, right? You have to do some work to find that sweet spot between debatability and provability. So let's evaluate some sample theses using this commercial we just talked about. Okay, so first example, this commercial uses Roseanne Barr to sell Snickers. I gotta tell you that a paper that would try to prove that thesis would put me to sleep. Because that is way, way, way too provable. In fact, it's so provable it doesn't even need to be proven. It's obvious, right? So that's a pretty terrible thesis. Let's try number 2. This commercial promotes the values of a tough working class masculinity. Now, that's a thesis that really kind of gets at the analysis we were just doing, and I think it's a really good thesis because it's not immediately obvious, but yet there's evidence in the commercial to prove it. So that seems to me like a really promising thesis. Number 3, this commercial is really about space travel. Or something I get in literature classes a lot. The characters in this story are really inside a mental hospital. Right? Not good, not real, right? There is no evidence to prove that thesis here. It seems really debatable until you might get excited for a moment, but it's not provable. Okay, number 4. This commercial uses humor to sell Snickers. Of course it does. I don't want to read a paper about that. That sounds really boring. Way too provable, not remotely debatable. Let's try 5. This commercial was the most successful Snickers ad to date. Well, that might be really interesting. Except, you know what? You only have 2 sources for this essay, the commercial and the school's essay. Neither one of those is going to be able to prove that this commercial was the most successful Snickers ad to date. You would have to go find some, market research to be able to prove that. So for this particular assignment, that thesis doesn't work. Okay, let's try 6. Like Scholes' commercial, this one promotes a vision of America, but unlike Scholes' text, this one is a clearly gender-specific one. I think that's a pretty good thesis. It's provable, and it's also pretty clearly debatable. And it's debatable because they're bringing Scholes in, right? Because they're like saying, this person is basically saying, Scholes is pretty right, but there's something we need to add to his theory. So I think that makes for a good thesis. They're debating with Scholes there. Okay. Number 7. This commercial uses humor, is about blue-collar work, and makes fun of comedians. So, do you immediately feel how discombobulated this one is? This is actually 3 pretty cruddy theses that are just being jammed together into one. It's not an idea. right? Whereas like look at number 2, that's an idea, a complex idea, but an idea, right? Whereas number 7 is actually like 3 different ideas. So that's not, we need our thesis is it's what unifies the entire paper together. So you don't want to have something that's actually just like 5 things that are totally separate that haven't been synthesized. Here's the image I want to leave you with today. So as you're writing this essay, and most especially when you're revising it after you're done with your draft, I want you to think about this idea that the thesis is the circulatory system of the essay, right? It's the blood flow of your essay. What that image suggests, I think, is that that thesis has to like reach out into every part of the essay. It's got to run through the whole thing, right? And if you have a paragraph that doesn't have a clear connection to your thesis, and here my image starts to get a little stupid. It's like your paper's kind of having a stroke or something, right? The blood supply is cut off, cells die off, and you wind up like in a nursing home or something. So this is not good. We don't want that to happen. You want to be sure that the arteries of your paper stay clear, right? That your paper, I could really go off the rails here, like your paper has not itself eaten too many burgers, even though I'll stop. But so you see what I'm saying, right? That the thesis it runs through the whole essay. Okay. And let me just finish up by reminding you that, again, just like last time, I'm going to be, I'm putting all this pressure on your paper, right? Here's all these things we're going to try to get right. But I need you to remember that the draft is not the place to stress out about all that stuff. The draft, you want to do your best and get it out, but the most important thing about a draft is that it's done, okay? And all of this stuff, like making sure your thesis is as good as it can be, that it runs through the whole paper, all of that kind of stuff can come in later. So here's what this week looks like. So you're going to do your questions and thoughts about this, rather discombobulated lecture. The discussion board for this week is going to start to get us into paper ideas. I'm going to start asking you to like find a commercial and start thinking about what schools might say. So we'll just start getting in there and assembling material for the essay. And your quiz is going to be about quoting, summarizing, and paraphrasing. That good stuff. All right, you guys. I am currently in Stockholm. Tomorrow I am off to Budapest, so I think your third lecture will probably be coming at you from Budapest, hopefully with some images. Great job with your Yelp reviews last week. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll be talking to you soon.